3, 2, 1.
Hello,
I'm Keira.
and I'm Newlin, and this is
A
Dialogue for the Dehumanized.
Today we'll be talking about the pedagogy of the oppressed and how individual and societal ignorance contribute to situations symbolized by the cave in the allegory of the cave. Now Eli, I would like to ask you, how and why do oppressors contribute to the oppressed's mythical, superficial worldview, and how does this intensify their ignorance of reality?
Well, the oppressors contribute to this mythical, superficial worldview because it benefits them directly. It keeps the oppressed in their current state and keeps the oppressors in their comfort. By creating these mythical, superficial worldviews for the oppressed and then supporting them, they create an effective red herring that distracts the masses from the real issues that they're suffering.
You saying I just want to summarize this and see if what I'm surmising is correct. The oppressors use this knowledge and their opinions and force it onto their citizens to bring them away from real issues and oppress them into what they want to think.
Yeah, exactly. They're educating them, but in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even call it educating. They're manipulating them. They're feeding them slop. That just guides them in the wrong direction because that's what benefits them. That's what gives them more money, more power.
Yeah, and if these people continue consuming this law, then at what point do they stop thinking for themselves?
That's an important question because what happens is that the more slop you feed them, right?
Yeah.
The more ignorant they get, and the more ignorant someone is, it's a positive feedback.
Mm-hmm.
They get more ignorant, they accept more. They get more ignorant, they accept more. And we see this happening today. There's, I would say, for example, Jewish people owning the world. That's been a theory for a long time, but it's gotten really popular, I'd say, the past few years. And once a few things become accepted by the masses, they sort of slowly become more open to accept whatever's thrusted upon them. We see Paulo Freire, he discusses how the relationship should not be a banking system, where they just sort of dump load information that is expected to be, retained by the individual. He's referring to a much older concept. But it's been translated into our short form content and the algorithms that we consume because the information is just coming in waves to us in our brains, not actively engaging and digesting it, but instead
we're just accepting it.
Accepting it, yeah. At least subliminally. We may not realize we're doing that.
Yeah, and now I'd like to ask, how does this connect to the allegory of the cave?
Well, in the allegory of the cave, the shadows engulf and distract the prisoner's minds from the truth of the outside world. They build their identity and formulate an entire societal structure revolving around these shadows as the absolute truth. And similarly, the oppressors in our life, they pave a society before us, for us. Stuck towards the shadows of our news outlets and algorithms, we're sort of sedated by this passive information constantly thrusted before us. It's sort of like these TikTok videos and these short form content videos, they're sort of, I would say, comparable. They parallel the shadows that are used in the allegory of the cave. Because, especially with our younger generation, Gen Alpha, being educated pretty much on the screen, and what that's happening is there's a reduced critical thinking, and I think that kind of goes along with the banking system that Paulo warns about, and as a result, people have just become more ignorant and accepting of the shadows.
And now, I'd like to ask you, how does the oppressed internalization of the oppressors imitate being trapped in a cave?
It imitates being trapped in a cave as the internalization, it creates a labyrinth of self-hatred and doubt that slowly sort of builds and it eventually radiates off of the individual. What this does is, as the oppressor eventually sort of internalizes this rhetoric that the oppressor gives to them, it sort of becomes a chronic illness inside of them. And as it builds inside of them and as it grows and nestles in, the oppressed sort of are stuck in this thing where they accept their role as the oppressed and see that as the only role. They see themselves as that, as nothing else, and they wouldn't want to be anything else. Because a human is pretty adaptable. They don't want to live perpetually in a state of, oh, I don't want to be this, I don't like this is not rational for me.
How does the author use rhetorical devices to further his message / present his concepts? And how does this overlap with those in the allegory of the cave?
Well, two of the most notable rhetorical devices that Paulo Freire decided to use throughout his book were anaphoras and italics. especially italics. These are really important for his rhetoric, as they not only emphasize complex words that require further clarification, such as raison d'etre. Apologies, I'm probably going to butcher this, but it says consentia sal. These are complex words, some are coined entirely on his own, such as the latter. And when he italicizes these, it allows for the reader to pause and reflect on these specific words. But the other usage he uses is actually for simple vocabulary such as with or for. And we see that he uses these as clarification of what he means in explanations of prior dissertations on subjects. For example, when he says that political action on the side of the oppressed must be pedagogical action in the authentic sense of the word, and therefore action with the oppressed, he sort of simplifies and condenses his prior argument that was a lot more verbose and complicated into a way that summarizes and asserts the course claim of his previous argument.
Yeah.
And this connects to the allegory of the cave, as Paulo sort of acts as the hypothetical individual who drags the prisoner out of the cave. By using these subliminal rhetorical devices, he leads the audience into his rhetoric in a way that mirrors what he propagates in his book.
Yeah, like, they're kind of forcing the reader to have a dialogue with themselves about what he's talking about. Like, why is he emphasizing this? Why is he emphasizing that? So they could kind of enlighten themselves.
Right, exactly. He's talking about this ideal form of education that is dialogue between the teacher and the student and collaboration, and yet he's doing that with you throughout the entire book and slowly leads you towards the light yourself. Mm-hmm. Not only an instruction manual for how to teach others to be enlightened and how to help others reach this class consciousness, or conscientization as he likes to coin it, but it also effectively is a guidebook for you.
Oh yeah, and just for the listeners, the word that we cannot pronounce, the consonant, that translates to critical thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've said enough. Now it's on to you, Keira. In what ways is education used by oppressors similar to the fire in the allegory of the cave?
Yeah, so in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, education is a tool used to force knowledge onto people or students. In the book, the system where students are being forced this information every day, 5 days a week, or at least in America, is coined as the baking system. And it's a metaphor used to portray the depositing of knowledge onto these students, like bake accounts. Mm-hmm. And the knowledge the students are forced to memorize is not because the student wants to learn it, but it's required. And not only that, everyone wants education, and it's one of the highest forms of power someone can have. Because of this, America forces education on people. And I'm not saying education is a bad thing, obviously. In the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he's criticizing how it's being forced onto students and how it's really detaching them from reality.
I mean, I think the open dialogue method that he proposes sort of insinuates that not that any student doesn't need education, but that all students need different education. And the conversations that they have with their educators leads them into different pathways that are most suitable for them and allows them to be their best self and perfect their purpose in this world. I think that's a much more efficient way of looking at it.
And it also can lead to sort of passion. But I'd like to ask you a question. Is the acceptance of any information really education? For example, if a classroom of students were being taught every word in the dictionary and the definitions, but knew nothing else, would they be considered educated?
Of course not. They're not taught how to synthesize those words. They're not taught how to interact with them. They're taught what they mean, the denotation, but they don't know the connotation.
Yeah.
There's no depth to their knowledge. It's just shallow information, like code, but not really a deeper understanding of anything within it.
Yeah, and that goes to show that being educated is more than just possessing a lot of information or knowledge. It's also how one gains the knowledge and how they use it as well. There's a purpose behind it.
Right.
And as explained earlier, the education system is just based off the banking system where they're being deposited this knowledge.
Right.
So unless students have a way of understanding why they're learning this and how they could use it, they're not really being educated.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what's interesting is I would like to relate that to the different teaching styles that are often discussed in at least America. The hands-on versus the reading versus the audio listener, like the audio learner, right?
Yeah.
I think what people get wrong is oftentimes they hear hands-on learner, and they think that means only physical hands-on.
Yeah.
But I think what they fail to realize is that no student truly is learning anything if they don't have either the metaphorical, physical, or both hands-on method in their education. Because no student learns just from reading a book. No student learns just from listening to a podcast, right? They only truly learn if they engage with the material. And that's what Paulo is talking about when he says that just sort of accepting this information is not adequate, because when you just sort of accept what's provided to you, you're not actually going to learn anything.
Yeah, and we could relate this back to the allegory of the cave as the knowledge that's being given to the students. It's like the fire in the allegory of the cave. It's an imitation of reality and the purest form of knowledge, when really it's not.
And I think that's what leads me to ask to the next question, right? So you were discussing how this fire is an imitation, right?
Yeah.
But I'd like to ask you, what's forcing them to visualize these shadows that the fire is creating, right? And that's the chains. So I was curious what you thought of these chains and how they relate to Paulo Freire. And my question is, how is the people's inability to partake in dialogue with one another caused by their symbolic chains?
The lack of discussion and education is one of the driving forces in the oppression of the oppressed. And for instance, as Paulo describes it, if there's no dialogue between the students and the teacher, then the students will naturally detach what they're learning from reality. For example, the sciences that they learn are simply just artifacts of the past that were randomly discovered, or the history of the world are just pages in a textbook. There's no real connection to reality when they're just being deposited this information.
No, yeah, for sure. And when you don't synthesize these pieces of information together, it's all isolated blocks of, well, no meaning, right?
Yeah.
And that's honestly tragic, because one of the most beautiful things about education is connecting not only the ideas within each subject, but subjects themselves. And I think using the banking system of education, as discussed by Paulo Freire, you're sort of chaining yourself against a wall that isolates all disciplines and all subtopics within each discipline. And this sort of leads to a fragmented and provincial understanding of the world around you. When in reality, the dialogical method of education, it sort of creates a web that branches not only topics within a discipline or subject, but also subjects themselves. Math and English, science and social studies, science and math and English. Like it's all connected. And when you connect philosophy and math and science, and especially the STEM and the liberal arts together, you create a more complete understanding of the world around you. And that's what dialogue allows, is that it allows synthesization of information.
Yeah, and we didn't just learn English, we stopped English. And then we went on to math. We developed and started learning about these things all at the same time through coexistence, and we're still learning more about all of them, so there's no reason why we should separate these and learn about them individually and just as.
Right.
And the absence of a dialogue and a teacher-student relationship ultimately separates the students from being able to think about how the information they're being given affects the world today and how it affected the world in the past. This is because when there's a dialogue between the teacher and students, the students aren't being told what to think, they're inquiring about what is relevant to their world. And this way of coming about knowledge is how students tie their knowledge back into reality. And this way the students can see how they too can bring change to their community.
Exactly, yeah.
What I found interesting while reading the Allegory of the Cave is that Glaucon, Socrates' apprentice, although being prompted to answer questions from Socrates, he does not really partake in a dialogue or discussion. He instead just immediately agrees in like the most simple sentences possible. He's like, that's true, most definitely. He never asks, why is that so? Right. You could agree, but you could ask why.
Right.
And they could dive deeper into why this may be true, and Glaucon can have a chance to be like, I don't fully agree with this.
Right. And as a result, you get a one-sided story, the Allegory of the Cave. You don't get nuance within it. And I wouldn't be surprised, I mean, after all, the story first appears allegedly in The Republic, which was created by Glaucon's brother, Plato. It would not surprise me if Plato intentionally kept it, or even exaggerated this sort of disparity between Glaucon and his mentor, Socrates, as sort of an irony to what they're talking about in the Allegory of the Cave. That sort of ignorance and acceptance from Glaucon in contrast to the assertiveness of Socrates' ideology.
Yeah. And now we'll be moving on to a recap.
So, Keira, what did we learn?
So we learned today that the oppressors forcefully detach the oppressed from reality. Furthermore, we discussed how once trapped in the cave, the oppressed instinctively reject enlightenment because it's unnatural and uncomfortable. And then after that, we discussed how information is being used to bring a false sense of education to the oppressed. And then finally, we discussed how the absence of a dialogue in education is a tool for oppression.
That sounds about right to me, Keira. And I think that's all for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in into the pilot of A Dialogue for the
Dehumanized.
For more information about this episode, for episodes, check out our Instagram, linked below.